All right, I think we have critical mass. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited for this conversation about how working with nature can help Colorado Basin communities and ecosystems prepare for a hotter and drier future. I'm Nicole Lampe from the Water Hub, and we have a really great panel who I will introduce in a moment. First, just a bit about what inspired this conversation. As you all know and have helped to support, the river has been in the news and in the public eye, I'd say more than ever recently. But a lot of that coverage has focused on the current crisis, specifically how can we save 2 to 4 million acre feet of water to keep the reservoirs keep the river flowing through the dams. That focus obviously is understandable given the high stakes, but we know that interim solutions aren't enough to bring the basin back to health. That's why we've convened this great panel of expert practitioners to talk about the opportunity now with billions in federal funding to rehydrate the landscape with nature-based projects from the headwaters all the way down to Southwest states in the Salton Sea. We are joined today by Felicia Marcus from Stanford's Water in the West, Karina Bracer from National Forest Foundation, Kern Collymore from Sixth World Solutions, Frank Ruiz from Audubon, and Katlo Shipik from Watershed Management Group. And I'm very excited to be co-facilitating this conversation with Teal Leto, also known as Western Water Girl. Teal, do you want to briefly introduce yourself and share a little bit more about your interest in this topic?
Hi, everyone. My name is Teal, and I am mostly known for my presence on TikTok as the Western Water Girl. I produce extremely hard-hitting and snarky videos that explain the situation in the Colorado River Basin, and I do my best to make it relatable and understandable. But I have noticed that in general, the content that I make that is related to solutions within the basin is not reaching as many people. And I think it's really important for us as journalists and community members to make opportunities to discuss solutions in a way that are engaging and entertaining for people who are viewing or reading that information. And also, like Nicole said, I really think it's important for us to start looking towards long-term solutions within the basin, and in ways that are sustainable and equitable for every user within the basin.
Thank you, Teal. And in terms of the structure from the hour, we're going to hear briefly from each panelist about their area of work. And then we will have time for questions and answers at the end, probably about the last 20 to 30 minutes. But we invite you to drop questions into the chat or the Q&A at any time, and we'll get to them at the end. And I'd love to start with Felicia Marcus. As I said, Felicia is the Land Earth Visiting Fellow at Stanford Water in the West, and she authored a recent report on nature-based solutions in the Colorado River Basin. Felicia, can you share some top takeaways from that report? I'll drop the link into the chat.
Thanks so much. And that's great that folks have it. It was written as a primer for the layperson, more or less, particularly water people who didn't really know climate policy, but also for climate policymakers who didn't really understand water or nature-based solutions and how you can bring these two very different worlds together at a useful level. You know, the space is way more complicated, messy, integrated than the traditional parts per billion environmental issues many of us started with and also work on. It's more complicated than counting carbon parts per billion in the atmosphere, but it's vitally important on a host of levels, and there's real opportunity here. So I hope you'll dig in afterwards in the months and years ahead. The thing about it that was amazing is the biggest takeaway, and maybe I'm being a little emotional about it, is that there's really magic in this space and a lot of momentum, and the necessity and the opportunity to seize that opportunity and to meet the challenge is breathtaking when you think about it. There's been a whole trend at the international level going for a number of years, sort of probably highlighted in the 2019 IPCC report on land-based emissions that made it really clear that unless we deal with land-based emissions, we can't get there from here. We could stop emitting fossil fuels tomorrow, and we're still going to live in unlivable world, and that dealing with land-based emissions, both from things like deforestation as well as wildfires, et cetera, and destruction of meadows and agricultural lands, land disturbances, et cetera, that if we started managing it more effectively and working with nature more effectively, we could meet up to 37% of the carbon reduction load that we need to have. And it was kind of amazing to me to see that wildfires alone, wildfires that come from these outsized conflagrations that aren't just natural fire, they're fires that are hotter, bigger, and more frequent than they were before because of the fact of not managing our forests, because of Smokey Bear's well-intentioned fire suppression efforts, but misplaced in some ways, the squelching of natural fire and this incredible buildup of fuels that these wildfires are now in many places, if not everywhere, emitting more carbon than fossil fuels, which doesn't mean not working on fossil fuels. We need to redouble that effort, but we also need to start putting more effort into the natural land space. And the beauty of that is that there are multiple benefits that come from it. And the challenge of dealing with it is that there are multiple benefits that come from it, each of which tend to be managed and quantified in a silo. So if you look at doing this work from a part per billion carbon not emitted into the atmosphere or an acre foot of water received for action, it's going to be a fraction of what you get. But if you look at it from a multi-benefit perspective, it's pretty wondrous. And yet we don't have common public policy tools for that. There's some work going on at Pacific Institute and the CEO water mandate on that, but a lot more needs to happen. So those were kind of the headlines. At the national level, we're getting it. You've got billions coming in, and I know we'll talk about this later, at the national level, both in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and in the Inflation Reduction Act, because the federal government really sees this as an amazing opportunity. And actually during COP and getting no traction on it that I saw, on November 8th, they issued a roadmap for using nature-based solutions to help communities, the economy, and climate that I really encourage people to look at. With forests, you end up with this multiple benefits that are easier to capture, and yet people who don't work on forests don't think about forests. And I guess my point was to say we've got to think about this whole suite of landscapes from top to bottom of the watershed. But if you start at the top, you have the opportunity to prevent catastrophic wildfires, which prevents these massive carbon plumes. You protect life and limb, which is in part why it's been easier to put billions of dollars into this, because that's the benefit of benefits in many ways. But you also get water benefits, and the quantification isn't precise yet, but it's growing, and there are experts working on it. Again, not dollar per acre foot in isolation, but together, that by managing our forests and allowing more snow that does fall, so we know less snow will fall, more rain will fall with a few degrees temperature rise, more can hit the ground, and if you keep it still shaded, it can last longer. So the timing benefits of snowpack as our single largest storage venue can be preserved a little bit. Then if you move down the watershed and you do meadow restoration, meadows, which allow for the slower meandering of water, just pack a punch in terms of benefits, in terms of groundwater recharge, in terms of seeping into the land and going across it, creating refugia during fires, creating natural fire breaks, but also sequestering carbon and slowing that flow of water, which is essential to help with that water flow later in the season when we use more of it for agriculture in particular. So there's a linkage between our ag lands at the bottom and our forest and meadow work at the top. And the problem with our setup is that we manage these things in isolation, but there are efforts at the states, which I know we'll talk about in a moment, that are also making a difference. And then finally, there are many other things, but the other thing that really struck me was the magic of beavers, which, since I started writing the report, there have been a massive number of stories. I was like racing to get it done. I had to keep updating my paper, but as nature's engineers, these little guys can restore meadows on their own faster than anything. And the results are striking, and the quantification that's starting to happen in terms of the carbon sequestration potential, as well as that timing benefit for water, is pretty huge. And I'm just scratching the surface because I know we're not supposed to talk that long right now, but there's plenty more where that came from, where there's just this wonderful opportunity to meet the climate challenge, solve some water problems, and create a healthier ecosystem for people and critters in a way that has eluded us as we've over specialized in the work we do. But it's hard because you've got to work across silos.
Thank you so much for that. I feel like I just learned so much. I was wondering if you could weigh in on how states are using nature to combat climate change and how this new federal funding might support those efforts.
Well, that's easier in some ways. I mean, there aren't as many states that have hopped on the bandwagon, at least in the Colorado Basin. California is the most evolved in their planning and in their implementation because they've been able to use billions in total from their cap and trade proceeds to go into this for a number of years. And certainly the wildfires of 17 and 18 really sparked, no pun intended, a massive infusion of dollars into fire prevention, and the cap and trade money allowed it to go into that, but also into meadow restoration, which they recognized even without the data would make a difference, and in their healthy soils programs. And that it's a long story, but we can talk about there are a lot of different things you can do in agriculture to make a big difference, although a lot of it takes yearly work. And so they're doing a lot of that work. And they recently have taken the next set of steps, and these are all in the paper, so I won't go through it in detail, in their current scoping plan update, which is the update they do every 5 years of the shape of what they're going to do in their rules in the coming 5 years. They're going long on nature-based solutions and forests in particular, even acknowledging that doing the forest management takes to take out all this excess fuels and trees. And clearly you've got to take out the little ones, the brush, all the things that create the fuel ladder that allows these massive fires to burn, and to burn even the old trees, that you're going to have a loss of sequestration in the short run because you're taking out biomass, but in the long run, you're going to prevent bigger emissions that come from wildfire. And that is a massive watershed, so to speak, for CARB, which it's much easier to prove a technical thing, but they know it to be true. And they know, and they explicitly talk about the multiple benefits because they're part of one state. And then in parallel, the Resources Agency put out a really good Climate Smart California plan that pulls this all together and even cuts it down by regions within the state and what the opportunities are. In the region, the other two states that are looking at it, and I sat through, I read all the reports for one and sat through all the listening sessions for the other, Colorado and New Mexico, are developing nature-based solution. Natural working lands is the term that most states use, plans to deal with climate. And I think those are a really important place to encourage and watch. They don't have a ton of resources. They're nowhere like California, but California can provide at least some ideas for them to build off of. And there's a really important study being done by TNC, World Resources Institute and U.S. Climate Alliance, on looking at nature-based solution opportunities for climate in both New Mexico and Colorado. And that should be coming out sometime next year and provide something of a roadmap. And my paper has 1 million how-to and recommendations, but those two states are places to watch. Nevada has a little piece of it. Other states do some of it, even if they don't call it climate, like Arizona has pieces of these things. And the final thing I'd say about the states, it's, I think, important for the folks who cover climate, and probably my most important recommendation is that, most states that have a climate program have a complementary energy strategy, energy efficiency, alternative fuels, both promoting them and suppressing fossil fuels, all the things that the climate world, and at NRDC I own this as well, has really focused on. But frankly, we need complementary natural working lands policies that are at least as stringent and important given the magnitude of the numbers. And so far, only California is attempting it at that scale. And I have hopes that Colorado and New Mexico will really step up because of the multiple benefits. They made noise. They have really good people who really want to do this, particularly the state forester in New Mexico and the folks in natural resources and water program in Colorado, but it's going to need more support, I think, in order to really come to fruition.
Thank you.
Arkansas is doing a lot. Other states outside the Colorado are doing a lot, Oregon, etc.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Felicia talked quite a lot about the vital role that forests play in protecting clean water. And so I want to turn next to Karina Bracer from National Forest Foundation. Is there anything more you want to say about the role that forests play in providing both clean water and ample water supply?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. And I'm very appreciative of all the interest in the work of the Colorado River Basin and water issues, which are really critical in so many ways. And yeah, of course, healthy forests do, I think, have a lot of different values, multiple benefits, as Felicia mentioned. But I want to focus on the water right now. And so the healthy forest ecosystems have impacts on water quality and water quantity. You can look at it from those two lenses, although it also helps to sort of mitigate extreme weather and reduce impacts from weather as well on water resources. And there are clear and measurable benefits, both to the ecosystems themselves and also to society from the impact of healthy forests. So improved water quality, just to sort of describe it pretty in a very basic way, comes from, amongst other things, the vegetation helping to trap sediments and pollutants that would otherwise run off, down into our waterways, flow downstream, and affect users. That's sort of the primary quality impact of the vegetation. And then healthy forests and forest health projects can also increase water quantity, which is critical as well, as we know, because they more efficiently help to replenish meadows and springs and wetlands, as Felicia was mentioning. So essentially, they're also helping the vegetation helps to regulate the water flows and help to protect downstream areas from flooding, which is another major potential impact. And it's really important to note that high elevation forests are home to the headwaters of many of the rivers that ultimately feed into the Colorado River Basin and the Colorado River Basin. So these upper elevation forests, mostly within the National Forest System, the U.S. Public Forest, which is where the National Forest Foundation, my organization, predominantly works. So these lands in the National Forest area represent about 20% of the total land area of the Colorado River Basin, but they have a disproportionate, more or less 60% production of water for the entire river basin. So it's a much smaller land area with a very big impact on the amount of water that is generated and the quality of that water. And then large scale restoration efforts, which you can do over these large national forest areas, help to reduce, return perennial stream flows. A lot of the flow that we see is very, sporadic and not continual. So these tributaries and streams that have not run for decades, some of them, or have run in a very small way, are also benefited by these healthy forest projects. And then finally, fire. I can mention that fires in forests and forest areas particularly have a huge impact on water quality, apart from, of course, all the other social impacts that it can eventually have. But we do have evidence of watershed health projects in forested areas, making the land much more resilient against the fires. So the increased wetness in the forested areas, or highly vegetated upper forest areas, have a healthier environment, and they mitigate fire risk, so reduce the fire risk, but also will reduce the severity of fires. Both of those things are important. So if fire does come, and the headwaters restoration projects also serve as anchors for fuel reduction treatments, which is really critical to do. In fact, we have a lot of excess materials so we do need to reduce the fuels. And a lot of the watershed health projects that we do, that the forest, national forests do, are about reducing breaking up the landscape scale fuel continuity. And if a fire is to come, if we reduce the severity of it, that'll help to stop the massive amounts of erosion. I mean, we have videos of streams of just the erosion coming down after an area is not vegetated, and the downstream users are just having this horrible quality and just very big impacts, apart from the flooding that can happen. And so those are some of the forest health benefits.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think the connection between forest health and watershed health is often overlooked. In my area, my home river is the Animas River, and in 2018 we had a very large forest fire, and there was flash flooding immediately after that, and it killed about 80% of the fish in our river, which was just a tragedy. I was hoping that we could zoom in on a specific restoration project that you have underway. Can you talk about the Trail Creek project and explain how it will benefit the Gunnison and Colorado rivers? And in that, can you explain how you think about a forest project like that holistically in a way that benefits the water cycle and the fire cycle of that area?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is a project that we're very excited about. One of our first projects using the low-tech process-based restoration, a very jargony word, but it's essentially an approach where, as Felicia mentioned, working with beavers is one of the ways, one of the methods of low-tech process-based restoration. So this Trail Creek project in Colorado Gunnison area, the Gunnison National Forest, demonstrates our practices of working together with the National Forest, the managers of the National Forest, and of various other experts of all kinds, hydrologists, geologists, engineers, etc. But in this case, what we're doing is building very minimal structures. So that, these are on the high elevation watersheds in that area. And the goal is to reestablish the stream process, essentially, right? So this, and I'll mention a little bit later, but these structures that mimic beaver dams, so they're called beaver dam analogs, and we insert with little posts and then, block it up with some twigs and branches. And eventually the beavers do return, because the damming of the water behind our beaver dam analogs is what then allows the beavers to find secure habitat, but also a bunch of other animals, fish that have been, removed from many of these degraded upper elevation areas. So, and then once you pool the water, it is able to sort of overflow the banks of currently damaged, very narrow, fast-running streams that are incised, as they're called. And so the water then can, acquire much broader and deeper flow regimens, essentially. And so that is very helpful to the, upper elevation watersheds. We also do a lot of removal of invasive species at that area, and in general in our forest health projects that have a big impact on water. So the Trail Creek project started in 2021, and in a very, very short time, in fact, even weeks after you install these beaver dam analogs, you already have a very big water impact visible immediately. I actually would love to have shared some photos, and I'm happy to do so afterwards. But so the resilience of this previously degraded ecosystem returns pretty fast. And so we're already able to see the improvement in water quality and return of the wetlands, as we were mentioning, water flowing much slower. And we're really excited to see what's going to happen this winter with the snowpack and how much longer, what is the sustainability of this wetness in the upper elevation. So forested watershed areas, essentially. So yeah, and so the high elevation areas is, where we hope to do additional projects like that Trail Creek project. There's a lot of groups working on, trying to, collaborate with the beaver and basically just, recuperate how it already was working. And we sort of took it away. So yeah, we're very excited about a lot of the work that can happen in the national forests in terms of supporting water quality, replenishment, quality, and all of that.
Thank you so much, Karina. Moving now down the river, I want to hear next from Kern Collymore, who's co-founder of Sixth World Solutions, and along with his partner recently was recognized with the Indigenous Resilience Leadership Award. Kern, we know that agriculture is the biggest user of Colorado River water, but the farmers, like everyone else in the West, are going to have to make do with less. Can you please talk about the drought-friendly farming methods you've been learning and developing with Dene farmers?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I guess just to give a little foundation of where I'm coming from as I answer this question is I'm a history person. I love history. I love how things started, where they come from. And And I think that's a really important question, because as you look at the history of agriculture in the Southwest, or, you know, in the Colorado River Basin, there have been large scale ag producing peoples for a long time, right? The Colorado River Basin has supported quite a few different numbers of tribes in the area, right? So when we talk about agriculture today, I guess we're really pointing to the fact that this large scale agriculture that we're engaging in is at this point where it's unsustainable, right? The systems that we're utilizing in terms of tilling and monocrops, the pesticides and clear cutting, it's leading to exacerbating situations where we are using more and more water. So as you mentioned before, with these droughts, like how are we reducing these ways? And I think that just what we've seen is, when you look at the people doing the work on the front lines of this, you know, the new word is regenerative agriculture. It's traditionally been local communities, indigenous tribes, frontline peoples who are doing these works, right? So there was recently a study that said 80% of the world's biodiversity is being overseen by indigenous tribes. And it was cool listening before, as we were mentioning, forest management and forest fires, and how that was something that these tribal communities had been incorporating, but were forced to stop, right? You know, and as we're talking about things like nature-based solutions, COP27 was just came to an end, but we see how sometimes if tribal communities aren't on the front lines of the creation of these solutions, they kind of fall short. So nature-based solutions as looking at like just leaving this land alone. So even the indigenous peoples from this land can't access their traditional medicines or can't go upon it and do their traditional hunting. And how, you know, as we start looking at solutions, the really important fact that we make sure that frontline communities are there. Indigenous communities are there because they are the ones who've been holding this knowledge for a long time. So when we talk about agriculture, it's at least for me, it's like important to point out, right? Like there's like the farming that we do today, which is this very system that's been focused more upon profit and how are you able to, like, you know, the biggest yield you can bring back. And we literally have farmers who are feeding the country who can't feed themselves. So this system that we're seeing, right, is unsustainable. So, you know, we're talking about these waterways and these water practices, and as I said before, the solution is looking at our communities, looking at our frontline indigenous communities, and what solutions are some of the things that we've been seeing. You know, rain passive water catchment. So I care about the benefit of marshes, right? It's because they allow the water to spread and sink. And how do we do that actively? Utilizing teams of young people, you know, working with our local farmers, our local land restoration groups. So those are things that have been done on the ground. You know, you're looking at drip irrigation systems. Those have been techniques we see people working on. So as opposed to, you know, sometimes I drive to like Cortez, I'll drive up to Colorado, and you see these fields and it's just spraying everywhere. And then you're watering everything and anything within that area. And some of these farmers now are saying, well, you know what, I'm just going to put the water right here where the seed is right here. And you know, these type of ways of conserving water in more beneficial ways. But, you know, also the fact that in general, these large scale producers we just water our fields like in the daytime, usually during like the hottest part of the day, you know, between like 12 and 4, you see these huge sprinklers going on. But there's been no research that shows that watering your plants at night is any less beneficial, and then your plants have so many more hours to drink. And these are like on the ground solutions that we're seeing people implementing. Again, being in the Southwest and some of these desert communities, people putting up these shades, these huge shades over their greenhouses, which allows them to grow longer. Because again, one of the problems we see with greenhouses in the summertime, getting really hot where you can't even like utilize them anymore. But there are these on the ground solutions, these decentralized solutions that are being done across the board. And I think that it's important to get the resources down to those communities. So earlier, Felicia mentioned some of the money that's coming down through different government funding and different programs. But having worked on the ground for such a long time, we see like this big disconnect between funding that's supposed to go towards communities, or funding that's supposed to go towards building up regenerative agriculture or permaculture or land management, and then they usually end up in these other places, right? A quick example I have is back when the CARES Act was supposed to go towards rural farmers and food deserts, that ended up going to a lot of inner cities. And I have no problem with money going to like inner cities to like work on food security, but that funding was initially supposed to go to rural communities. And I feel like it's time and time again where we don't see the resources going to the communities or to the people who are actually dealing and creating these solutions. And, you know, the USDA, they come up with these funding resources, with these funding proposals, and they say they want community input. And then the application is like a 15-page thesis where you have to like quote and like cite and blah blah blah. And it's like, well, you're asking for community input, and then you're asked, right, like asking these like deep level type of questions. I feel that kind of keeps farmers or keeps local people kind of excluded or separated from that, and we see it time and time again where resources come in and they don't make it down to solutions. Well, how do we create these, you know, grant applications or these methods and systems that do allow on the ground people to access them and see those resources?
Thank you so much for sharing that. I definitely feel like Indigenous perspectives are often left out of these conversations. So it's so important that you are providing us some insight from that perspective. I was wondering if you could explain how regenerative agriculture helps to support food security and drought resilience here in the Southwest.
Yeah, I touched on it a little while ago, but yeah, I think, you know, even terms like regenerative agriculture, or you know, these new kind of like academic or new age like words that are coming down the line, and it's right, sustainable living and sustainable growing that people, as I said before, people have been doing for a long time. So some of the ways I feel that we've been able to see those things happen on the ground is just ways of like building up your soil. So for a long time, tilling was this kind of like mindset that we were spreading in terms of land grant offices and ways of farming. But, you know, as we look at growing up the land, again, both Felicia and Karina mentioned earlier in terms of the forest, right? Allowing the land to soak, allowing water to infiltrate the ground, it helps farming so much. Again, we personally do a lot of agriculture as well, and you can see it from a sandy field, right, compared to a field where there's lots of like root penetration, there's lots of like grasses growing. The water stays longer, and the water sinks in longer too. So, you know, someone mentioned earlier when there was a forest fire and how there was a lot of flooding, and that's like, you know, water is kind of, it flows to the lowest point, and there are places when it's straight, it literally becomes like a shotgun. You know, excuse the terminology, but just in terms of how fast and how rapid that water can move and take soil and take ground matter. And when you have cover, when you have organic matter, that slows it down so much, and it's so impactful for allowing that water to like sink. And there's work being done on this, you know. Catlow mentioned that they're from Tucson, and you know, Lancasters have been doing a lot of work down there, and kind of written this book on how you do water management to more slow down the land. And I feel like it ties into farming so well, right? Like a lot of times someone's mentioned earlier how we decompartmentalize, or we compartmentalize these things, you know, like farming is here and like water is here and land management is up there. And for me and for the people that we work with, right, like it's all flows together. Where you decide to put your farm plot, right, it's going to rain, and is the water going to run through it? Is the water going to run past it? If the water's running past it, how do you get it to run to it? You know, like all these different ways of engaging with agriculture that allows you to engage in this larger being with the land around you, and with you know, starts to be with the community around you. So, you know, like yeah, it's just like taking care of like all the land and the water systems, and then, you know, the protection of those types of you know, the seeds and like the heirloom seeds that come from those ecosystems. You know, like when you're using seeds that have been grown there for a couple of generations, they're used to that area. You don't have to add as much water anymore. And again, these are just like some of the solutions that we're seeing that like farmers in our local area are doing. So for, you know, I know that after 4 generations, the seed's kind of considered yours. And one of the things of the seeds growing in a certain areas, if you don't have that much water and that fruit makes it to the end of the season, it makes seed. It's now used to not having that much water. And then you keep on going that way. And these seeds are being made in these localized area, which is why you have these type of like special corns. You have like Navajo corn and you have Hopi corn, right? Like those type of crops are used to being grown in those type of areas, which are used to these type of environments and ecosystems. And it's really cool as you like learn from these indigenous communities, because, you know, I've seen Hopi fields and they don't like have fences up, you know, and it's just really cool how they're able to grow outside of these PIA areas, which is one of these like criteria a lot of times for grants, like practical irrigable acreages, you know, like, and just really quickly, it wasn't until 2018 that the U.S. Farm Bill acknowledged dryland farming as a type of farming, right? And these are ways that indigenous peoples in the area have been using for millennia. So when we have people who are creating rules and creating laws, and they don't even see these systems as viable, you know, like that's why it's really important to make sure that these communities and indigenous peoples are on the front lines as we're making these rules, as we're talking about what this future looks like, because these communities have been doing it for a long time. So, you know, we talk about the impact that's going to be coming to farmers, and we can look and see how we can help alleviate those impacts by incorporating and engaging these technologies and techniques, and providing the resources to really make it pertinent. You know, that whole saying, put your money where your mouth is. And if we really want local communities to be able to fend for themselves and feed themselves and be decentralized, we need to be able to get the resources down to those communities.
Thank you so much, Kern. I want to acknowledge that we're running a little bit behind schedule. We will hopefully still have time for questions, but also we're going to follow up with a transcript and contact information for all these folks. So if you have follow-up questions that we don't get to during this hour and you have to hop right off, we can definitely connect you directly. I want to turn next to Frank Ruiz from Audubon, California. Frank leads Audubon Salt and Sea work, and Salt and Sea has been much in the news, including yesterday in relationship to the Colorado River. And I'd love, Frank, for you to talk about the connection.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. The Salt and Sea is intrinsically connected to the Colorado River, both hydrologically and politically, right? And the Salt and Sea is probably the tip of the iceberg in the West. And when I mean, you know, the tip of the iceberg, this is a result of years and years of the inability to approach the water crisis in a more comprehensive way, right? I usually, you know, say that the Salt and Sea, first and foremost, is a water crisis, and that is honestly the result of the settlers' mentality that has been unable to look at water and other natural resources in a much more comprehensive and holistic way. The Salt and Sea that we currently have, you know, will become even more exacerbated as climate change becomes worse. And unfortunately, communities around the sea being mainly BIPOC communities, don't have the socioeconomic or political capital to leverage their concerns. I say that if the South Sea was closer to the greater Los Angeles area or San Francisco, the problem would have been resolved, many years ago. But in addition to the environmental crisis, and I want to highlight this because the South Sea is probably the last standing jewel along the Pacific Flyway that connects birds, from Alaska all the way to South America. In California, we lost over 97% of the wetlands, either to agriculture or urban developments. So, but the South Sea is more than just an environmental crisis. It is a public health crisis, once and foremost. It's common to hear families of young kids complaining of asthma and COPD, respiratory problems. And I say that we have the highest asthma rates. And I base, my statement on the my knowledge of the local communities. The way that we measure asthma rates is either by hospital visitations, but a lot of these communities being BIPOC and underserved either don't have access to medical care or they have to go across the border to get their medical attention. So it's really difficult to quantify the number of kids that are dealing with asthma. But from my conversations and my knowledge of, the region, I think, this is probably one of the highest, if not the highest, asthma rate. The South Sea has been declining mainly after, 2003 when the quantification settlement agreement was agreed on. And it will start receding at a much faster pace after the new water cuts, that are, that you all heard, yesterday. The water districts are working with the federal government to conserve more water, but it can solve a problem, the Colorado River, but it can open up another pit, here in the area as the sea will continue receding and will recede at a much faster pace. Traditionally, we say that for every drop of water that comes into IID, a third of that water flows into the South Sea through the runoffs of the agricultural fields. So it was a great news to hear that the federal government is finally paying attention to this crisis. But I think, even though this is the first step, I think, we need a whole lot more than this. We need to have a better understanding of the water budget in the region, how the water can be distributed equitably, right? Not just, for the ag industry or for the lithium industry, but for the communities, for the environment that traditionally are not voices, that are invited to the table. And in 2017, Audubon put together what we call a habitat suitability model that gave us a good understanding how much land is needed around the Salton Sea just to allow the birds to survive. But even so, with the water becoming more limited, the South Sea shrinking at a faster pace, we lost more than a third of the species that used to come to the Salton Sea. In past decades, we used to have over 400 different species. Now we lost, pretty much a third of, those species, mainly the fish-eating birds. So the South Sea is very dynamic, right? And it needs, a dynamic approach. It needs, to have a comprehensive approach that understands all the different elements that are important, such as, how the water can be distributed. Yesterday, somebody was asking me, is this a great news, that now you got 250 million? I said, it's a great news, but we need a whole lot more. And in addition to that, we need to have a water security for the South Sea, for the projects that are being implemented right now and that will be continued to be implemented in the future. We need to have a water security. Otherwise, we can have money right now, but and most of you will know this, that as the crisis continue, our money will not equate to water, right? So I don't care how much money we have, we're not going to be able to buy the water. So we need to learn how to take it comprehensively and create a model that can be more equitable.
I was wondering if you could talk to us about the large wetlands project that Audubon is working on at the Salton Sea. Can you explain how that will benefit local residents and wildlife?
Absolutely. As the water continues, the sea continues to recede, a lot of the runoffs are no longer able to reach the sea any longer. So the water is percolating through the ground, creating these beautiful wetlands. And the last, I will say, 6-7 years, Audubon has been able to identify the emergence of new wetlands, over 6,000 new acres of wetlands. So nature is helping itself, and birds being opportunistic, they are taking advantage of a lot of these new wetlands. So Audubon wanted to be more intentional, and rather than waiting for other entities to implement projects on the ground, we wanted to be more intentional, and so we identified wetlands next to the community of Bombay that can be expanded, that can be enhanced, that can have multiple benefits. So the purpose of our approach is to create a multi-benefit approach that will provide habitat for the birds, for pupfish, for wildlife. But in addition to that, some of the areas adjacent to the Bombay Beach wetlands are very emissive. And the only way that you can suppress dust is through water. So we're trying to also bring the element that as we expand the wetlands, that we enhance it from and protect it from invasive species such as tamarisk or erosion. We can also provide additional benefits. And one of them is suppressing dust. That is, one of the biggest problems, here in the area. But in addition to that, we also want to engage communities, especially communities that live around the Salton Sea, and provide education opportunities for the young kids. I don't want to create environmentalists. I want to create leaders that understand that ecosystem is very intrinsically related to the economy, to public health and whatnot. So we want to create, and we are creating education pipelines, research opportunities. We're hiring young kids to come in, and from different local high schools, from colleges, to come and experience firsthand how wetland restorations can, perhaps here in the area, can be creative, using every drop of water in the most meaningful way, create a multi-benefit approach. So this is, our main objective. As we continue, we got some funding from BOR, and we're working in collaboration with IID, with CNRA, with other entities, and we're gonna divide it in. Well, we're divided in 3 different phases: the developing the design concept, the permitting, and finally construction. We're in the 2nd phase right now, and hopefully by next year we'll be able to break ground and create and expand these wetlands and cover up to 950 acres.
Thank you so much, Frank. And that's very exciting. Lastly, and certainly not least, I want to turn to Katlo Shipik from Watershed Management Group. Katlo, we know that Arizona will again receive less Colorado River water next year. Can you talk about how green infrastructure has helped Tucson prepare for this eventuality?
Great question, Nicole. And similar to Kern, I like to go a little bit back into history and kind of see where have we come from and where are we going. And I think thinking about green infrastructure, we first need to think and recognize that Tucson has over 4,000 years of continuous agriculture, thanks to the historic and continued stewardship of indigenous peoples. However, since the early 1900s, Tucson has been in a water crisis. So the shortage on the Colorado River, the current crisis, we've actually experienced crisis for well over the past 100 years, as the newcomers to the land have overpumped our groundwater and dried up our rivers. So then thinking about moving forward to the 1990s, we've been really working to reduce our overall water use and started importing Colorado River to replenish our local aquifers. So then thinking, what's the role of green infrastructure? We started recognizing that we need to better manage our local water. So in early 2000s, we began to seriously invest in green infrastructure solutions. And it was kind of a community based movement, kind of meeting with the local governments, municipality as well. And so it's kind of that bi-pronged approach. And so just to kind of quickly define green infrastructure, it is using natural features to slow, sink, and infiltrate rainwater and stormwater close to the source. So we can think of it as like rain gardens at homes, stormwater basins and swales along streets, even thinking about parking lots, what we can do in our parks, and then even moving beyond to restoring our floodplains. That can be green infrastructure. So by increasing our investment in rainwater and stormwater as a water resource, we realize we can nearly double our local supplies. And then couple that with demand strategies, we can really start to achieve true water resilience as a community. And so we as an organization, Watershed Management Group, we coined a fun term that we like to call going hydro-local. And so this is really thinking about how do we steward and wisely use our local renewable water resources, rainwater, stormwater, gray water, treated effluent, instead of sucking distant watersheds like the Colorado River dry. Like, why are we relying on extractive waters? And so green infrastructure can really help to nearly eliminate outdoor potable water demands, overall water demand by nearly half. Green infrastructure can enhance stormwater infiltration to recharge shallow groundwater areas of our watershed. Green infrastructure can combat urban heat stress through increased urban forest canopy coverage, especially in historically under-resourced areas of our community. We can even grow food resources without tapping into potable supplies. And then, so thinking, since 2018, the last few years, we have seen some of those results. We've seen an increase in surface water flowing in our creeks and rivers. And this is thanks to the collective work across the community to come together as a one water community and thinking about how do we better manage all of our local water resources and diversify our portfolio. And so some of this is through groundwater replenishment. Some of it has been recharging treated effluent in our rivers. And so we feel that by being hydro-local, Tucson can shift our path forward, our story, and support a shared collective effort to sustain flows in the Colorado River rather than continue to extract and diminish the Colorado River.
Excellent. I love hearing about the work that you're doing, and I would love to hear about what is needed to scale up this work so that it can be replicated to other cities within the Southwestern region.
Yeah, great question. And it's one always on the top of my mind. How do we scale up? How do we scale up locally? How do we scale up regionally? And I think first and foremost, it's focusing on shifting our communities from being water consumers to being water stewards. Thinking about, water farmers can be an urban population, fostering our connection to our rivers and creeks, celebrating our native plants. All of this helps to enhance kind of the sense of place and support and drive community stewardship. And having a collective community-centered approach is what I feel really helps to drive those simple, innovative, and collaborative solutions instead of relying on large infrastructure, big technology. I think secondly is investment in natural infrastructure. A lot of our speakers here today have already mentioned that. And it's really focused on how do we restore our local water supply. So from the mountaintops, especially those forest soils, which feed our springs and streams that then feed down into our urban areas, to then our river floodplains flowing through our urban fabric, even thinking about the smaller arroyos and those parks. How do we slow and spread and really infiltrate that water along the entire way? And then I'm so glad many of you have mentioned beavers. Even here in Southern Arizona, we should look to partnering with nature, like bringing back historic beaver populations. Yes, we had lots of beaver historically here in Southern Arizona. And so how do we bring that habitat back? And so I think most importantly to me is the health of our desert rivers and creeks, which can be an indicator of community resilience, water security, having a regenerative relationship to our natural systems that support us. And I think green infrastructure is actually quite simple. However, the hard part of it is the human-centered piece, because it is integrative, because it is intersectional, it requires a reframing of our approach that includes engagement of culturally rich, diverse communities, limited income households. It requires engagement and a collective effort across our community. And I think that's when I speak with other municipal governments and they're coming to Tucson for answers, they often miss that community aspect. And so they're driving it from the top down. And I think we need to remember that it needs to be really in parallel, in tandem with our community members. And it really needs to be fostering that stewardship across the community.
Thank you so much, Kern. We have just a couple minutes for questions. I don't know, speakers, do you have a hard stop at the top of the hour? Right now, we just have one question, which is open, but particularly addressed to Felicia and Kern. What opportunities do you see in the Inflation Reduction Act and or infrastructure bill to leverage Indigenous knowledge and get funds to these leaders who are already doing the work that will have the most impact? How can utilities, nonprofits use these historic federal funds to help support this? Oh, go ahead and unmute.
I was on mute, sorry. The Biden administration's been really good. I'm just going to give a couple of thoughts to start. The Biden administration is very good on all kinds of issues dealing with tribes, not just their appointments, which have been extraordinary, but also the commitment of funding, particularly water for tribes and other issues. And I think they'll be very responsive to outreach from tribes. It would be a place to start. But I appreciate the reference to water agencies, because one of the things I didn't mention was the leadership that water agencies are showing in this space. In Colorado, Denver Water has their Forest to Faucets program. I profiled the North Yuba Forest Restoration group that's been working very hard. And in that one, they're working very much with local tribe to pull together money to deal with it, to deal with upper forest management, both to be part of the community for the carbon benefits, but for those very important water quality prevention, degradation prevention issues that Karina mentioned so well, the sedimentation and the toxicity that comes from post fires. And so there's millions coming in from water agencies that help create the hub of how you then leverage the federal money and have lots of partners. And so I think following up on the Denver water model, as well as the Yuba Forest Restoration Partnership, is something that all water utilities should really be looking at, because it's in their interest and it allows them to create sort of a core kernel of funding that is much cheaper than cleaning out their reservoir after a fire. In the long run, it's a cheap insurance policy, but then brings in all these other partners, including private sector funding and others. So those are two opportunities. And the other thing I'd mention is the issue of Indigenous knowledge, TEK, and fresh water is getting more and more traction, even at the international level. The commission, I'm a public advisory committee member to for the 3 North American countries. We have a sister TEK expert panel with 3 from each country, and they're right now doing a freshwater initiative, and that has the ear of the environment ministers from all 3 countries. So that's something to watch and build on as well.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Kern, anything you want to add about how, as you said, federal funds have historically not always reached tribal and rural communities? Anything you want to say about how we can make sure that we do better with this tranche of funding?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'm going to leave my video off because my connection is better without it right now. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I would definitely say like removing the barriers to funding would be one of the big steps. And again, when I say barriers to funding, these like education qualifications and these like, 501c3 qualifications and these, all of these different hoops that people have to jump through to access a lot of these funds when it comes to, engaging in local communities. But, also to ensure like the alignment of this executive memo by the Biden administration, which was to engage with traditional knowledge, right? So like all federal agencies have to like start engaging more, like utilizing traditional knowledge. And to me, that automatically means engaging with like frontline communities. It means engaging with like indigenous communities. And once you do that, I think that a bunch of these hindrances in terms of getting resources down to local communities will hopefully start going away, because time and time again we see what's happening in local communities and indigenous communities kind of like being extracted and like digested and then like regurgitated as like kind of like new thing. And as we talked about before in terms of like forest management through like wildfires, and how like literally it was illegal for indigenous peoples to do these things, and now like we have like people like reintroducing this thing as this like new thing, right? When we talk about like again like these like catchphrases like regenerative agriculture, right? Like these are traditional knowledge techniques and methods that have been passed down and are out there. And when we start looking at this, kind of like how these words and how these terminologies like definitely help add towards the erasure of the work that indigenous peoples and local communities have continued to do to address these solutions. And when we look at it that way, as I mentioned before, then as I keep on saying, we'll make sure to make indigenous peoples and local communities are on the front lines of the creations of these solutions, because that's where, again, these solutions like keep on coming from. And it's important that these peoples are on the front lines of answering these questions and being in these meeting spaces.
Thank you so much, Kern. And thank you to all of our panelists, and also Teal for joining me and moderating this really awesome discussion. We'll follow up with the transcript, the recording, and some photos, as well as the contact information of all the speakers as soon as the transcript is ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.